Well, hello my mask making friends. I'm back here to make a new video about non-woven polypropylene and some tips for sewing your masks with the non-woven polypropylene, because there are a few challenges, one being that you can't iron it. But before I get into that, just want to talk to you a little bit about the non-woven polypropylene, because it's such a new material for so many of us. So back in early November, Health Canada came out with the recommendation to use a third layer, an inner layer of non-woven polypropylene. So basically cotton, non-woven polypropylene and cotton. The WHO actually even suggests having non-woven polypropylene on the outside as well as a potential combination. But at the very least, a middle layer as non-woven polypropylene. Now I have to make a distinction right out of the gate that we're talking about spunbond non-woven polypropylene, which is washable, as opposed to the melt-blown polypropylene, which is actually reserved for our healthcare workers for their PPEs, N95s, and so on. So for the cloth masks, we're looking at spunbond non-woven polypropylene. And also we have to consider the weight of the polypropylene. The suggestion is to use something in the range of 70 grams per square meter. So how would you know what that is? Not every supplier will tell you what the grams per square meters are, and it's very easy to measure at home if you have a kitchen scale. Simply take a square meter of your fabric and weigh it, and that's your grams per square meter. So back in October, even before the announcement, I went out to my local fabric store and I bought two types of spunbond non-woven polypropylene. At the time I wasn't sure about the weight, so I bought both. So the first one is the lightest one, and you can see actually it's quite see-through. It drapes nicely, but this is too light. This was measured at about 50 grams per square meter. If that was all you had, then I would suggest doubling up your layers just for additional protection. Ideally is you would go with something at 70 grams per square meter, and this is what I have here, and you can see that the drape is much stiffer, and that's basically all it is. It's still a little bit see-through, but it's just thicker than the other one, and I just simply measured it by taking a square meter and weighing it on my scale, and I could confirm that it was in the range of the 70 grams per square meter. So polypropylene is essentially a kind of plastic. So if you try to iron it, it will melt, and some people actually have ruined their irons. Some people will say that if you put your iron on a very low setting and it's already sandwiched between the two layers of cotton and you just go by really quickly on the seam, that they have not damaged their iron. However, I would caution against that simply because there's another option, and it's the technique of understitching, and this will allow your seams to be very stable and to lie flat and so on. So it avoids the need for using the iron altogether. So this is the main reason for this little tutorial. I'm going to show you what understitching is, what it's used for, and how you can do it and incorporate that in your mask making, whether it's the singer's mask or any other mask that you might be making for yourself. I have a dress here that I own, and basically this is the front part of the dress, and as you can see there are no visible seams, there's no top stitching, but the lining of the dress has to be kept in check because sometimes that lining can roll out, so it's important to have some stitching. So you see the stitching on the underside, but there is no stitching on the outside of the dress, and that's why it's called understitching. So this is a technique very common in dressmaking and tailoring, but it's perhaps less familiar to the quilters who are making masks. This is exactly the kind of seam that we're going to be doing with the mask. Here are the three layers typically that you could use for a mask. This is just scrap fabric for demonstration purposes, but it's 2 layers of cotton and the layer of the non-woven polypropylene. So you can imagine a mask that has an inner layer of cotton, and sandwiched inside will be your polypropylene layer, and then your quilter's cotton with the pretty design on the outside. And so this is basically your polypropylene sandwich. Of course, we're not going to sew it this way because normally we have to sew right sides together. So I'm going to take this top piece now and flip it over. This is going to be the good side of the inside of my mask, and I'll put that on top of the good side. This is the wrong side. The good side of the outer part of my mask. And now basically I'm sandwiching my lining, inner layer inside the two pieces here. So now we have the question of how to assemble this so that we're not actually poking holes through our non-woven polypropylene, because this is essentially like a piece of plastic. If you can imagine a sheet of plastic, and if you're to poke holes in the sheet of plastic, those holes will not heal. In cotton, sometimes the pinholes will actually heal as the fibers sort of redistribute themselves. So you have three options as to how to pin or clip your seam, so that your edges, so that you can have a stable seam. So I have here your three options. So the first option is to use the clips that are used in quilting and in sewing in general, but this is very popular with quilters. And you basically clip the edge that you're going to be sewing, and that way you have no pinholes. Now, I only invested in a set of clips just recently, maybe not even 2 months ago, so this wasn't an option for me in the early days. So another option is to use binder clips, and you would use them essentially in the same way, and you could just clip them and then remove them as you go. Now, if you don't have those two options, you can use pins, of course, which anybody sewing does have pins. What you want to do is just to make sure that you're not pinning perpendicular to your seam. It's best to pin in your seam allowance and pin parallel to the seam. So just pin within roughly your seam allowance, and that way any holes that you're poking through your fabric will be tucked away inside the raw part of your seam. So then you can sew along this edge. Now be sure that the heads of your pins are pointing towards you, so that as you sew you have easy grip and you can just remove your pins as you sew. So I'm going to take this to the machine now, and I'm going to sew my first seam along this edge. I've sewn the straight stitch along the edge, and now I will open it up to show the right sides. Typically, this is the stage where you would like to iron your seams open. And of course, with non-woven polypropylene, it's best not to iron. So how do we keep this seam from rolling and just being unstable? Essentially, what you do is you take all your seam edges, all the raw seam edges, and you push those over to one side in the direction of your inside portion of the mask, and keeping this outer portion completely free of any stitching. I'm at the machine and I've opened up my seam. I have my outer fabric on my left, and this is the inside portion on my right, and both right sides are facing me. I have nudged all the raw seam edges towards my right, towards the inner part of the mask, and I will be sewing along just close to the seam edge, just on the inside portion of the mask. So I'm going to position that. And what I'll do is I will pull a little bit, just coax the fabric open so that this seam is really opened up. The last thing you want is the lining to start rolling over to your good side. So you just want to pull that taut a little bit, not too hard, and then we can start sewing. So here we go. This is what it looks like And of course you would use a matching thread or something that's a bit less visible. I've used black so that you can see it. So now these two edges are going to, your seam is going to be nice and straight, and there's not going to be any rolling. Now you can use your fingers a bit to finger press that open a little bit more. But as you finish the other side of the mask and all the different sides of the mask, this will stay in place and you won't see any stitching on this side. You can always top stitch if you like, but this method allows you to avoid using the iron. So this technique works for any kind of mask. Of course, I used it when I made my favorite singer's mask, and I did the understitching on just about every seam I possibly could. I wanted a nice edge here at the top of my mask, so I did the understitching right along here. There's quite a bit of stitching because there's also the nose wire casing that goes right through the mask, so I didn't want too much stitching, and I really wanted to make sure that this edge would lay flat all the time despite washing. And I did the same on the underside of the mask, so you can see the understitching here, and of course you can't see any stitching on the outside. I did the burrito method for this mask, and I assembled the top part first to the front piece, and I did the understitching along here, and of course you can't see any stitching here. But just because of the nature of how the burrito method works, you can't understitch the bottom, but it really didn't matter. Things stay nice and stiff with the polypropylene. It really helps to keep its shape, and of course I have the horsehair in there, but you can watch my other video where I talk about this particular mask and how I made it. But I just wanted to show you the understitching on this mask. Well, I hope this video has given you a bit more information concerning non-woven polypropylene and some tips in sewing the polypropylene into your masks. But I want to attract your attention to a few websites and a few initiatives that are going on at the moment around polypropylene. So the first one is a website called makermask.org. And that website has been active since the early days of the pandemic, and it is dedicated to increasing the knowledge around reusable masks, and specifically, most particularly, in the use of non-woven polypropylene. So they've tackled topics, the science behind the polypropylene, and also sourcing it, and mask patterns, and so on. So there's a wealth of information on that website. And in particular, there's a blog post that is going to come out in the next day or so that's going to go into some of the details of the non-woven polypropylene and where it can be sourced, particularly if you're in the US. And they also have a fundraising effort because they're going to do some testing on some non-woven polypropylene and cotton combinations as well. They've done some testing in the past, and they're fundraising now to do a new round of testing. This is completely volunteer work, and it is completely open source. So I highly encourage you to visit that website, and if you can, donate to their fundraising efforts. Here in Canada, there is a website called clothmasks.ca, and on there you will find as well some information. And again, this is open source and it is run voluntarily. And on the blog of that particular website, you will find the article that was written for the conversation, and it talks all about non-woven polypropylene here in Canada. So that is also some information that you can look into. There is a group called the Cloth Mask Knowledge Exchange, and this is a group also volunteer to promote the knowledge and dissemination of the knowledge around cloth masks. And I have recently joined those efforts. So it's been very interesting. I have learned a ton between makermask.org and the Cloth Mask Knowledge Exchange. It's just been so interesting to learn so much, and then now I can take this information and pass it along to you. So I will have all this information in the description box below. If you're looking on a phone or tablet, you may not see the description box. Be sure you're to look on a laptop or a desktop computer so you can see that description box and get all the links. And of course, if you're interested in the singer's mask, I encourage you to look at the other videos on my YouTube channel where there's some advice, tips and tricks, and some full tutorials. And finally, for those of you interested in the singer's mask, I encourage you to visit our Facebook group, to join the Facebook group, and you'll find more tips and tricks on that page. So we're in December now, so it's time to wish you some happy holidays, and hopefully some of you can have a bit of a break. It's been a rough year, and I wish you all the best in the new year, but especially I wish you to stay healthy and safe in 2021. Thanks for watching.